For the past year, Bruce McArthur has become a household name associated with one of the most high-profile murder cases in Toronto. The 67-year-old landscaper was found guilty of murdering 8 men between 2010 and 2017. But perhaps an equally well-known name is that of Inspector Hank Idsinga. He's been the major case manager of the Bruce McArthur case since November of 2017 for a special edition of Grandes Entrevistas. We join you now from Toronto Police Headquarters. I'm sitting here with Inspector Hank Idsinga. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
If you could describe the last year or so with regards to the Bruce McArthur case with one word, what would it be?
Very, very hectic. It really was a whirlwind as soon as January 17th of last year hit. And it's funny, I've been going back over some of my notes and my files over the last week or so, going back to that day, and the amount of information and work that was going on from that day forward for months and months is just incredible.
Now, you've been quoted as saying that the city of Toronto has never seen anything like this before. Can you elaborate?
We've never had a prototypical serial killer like this before. We've had urban serial killers, gang members who have killed more than 1 or 2 people and been convicted of that. But I think this is the first prototypical serial killer we've had. We've had mass murders. We had a rather infamous fire several decades ago where a lot of people died in a fire and someone was convicted of multiple counts of manslaughter, but we've never had anything like this, and hopefully we never have anything like this again.
I'd like to go back to the moment that investigators first discovered the human remains in a set of planters on 53 Mallory Crescent. What was your initial reaction as they were being opened?
Well, we initially found those remains a couple of days, if not the day after Mr. McArthur was arrested. We had canine units searching 53 Mallory, and the canine units were showing some interest in some large planters at the back of the residence. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know why they were indicating those planters. We didn't know if there was something inside the planters, or there was something buried underneath the planters, or what was really going on. But at that point in time, we had no remains whatsoever and no idea where they were. Mm-hmm. So the planters were taken to the city morgue, where they had to thaw out for about a week and a half before they could be opened. And I was in the morgue with the anthropologist and the pathologist and Detective Dickinson the morning where they're finally at the point where they could, number one, x-ray them and confirm that there were indeed remains in there, and then be able to cut them and crack them open and expose those remains.
And when they were first cracked open, what were you thinking? What was running through your mind?
It was a very emotional moment, and it was a real a kind of a realization of the reality and the scope of what we were dealing with at that point in time. So, like I said, when we first arrested and charged Mr. McArthur with 2 murders, we had no idea where the remains were, and that was a huge question mark. And then to be able to get to the point very quickly where we discovered some of those remains in those planters and realizing, okay, reality is really setting in now, and we've done a lot of work, but we've got a lot more work to do. So,
of course. Now, McArthur was known to police long before he was arrested last year. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to assault with a weapon as well as assault causing bodily harm.
Right.
10 years after that, he was questioned as part of Project Houston. So in 2013, he was questioned by police. And this was in regards to the disappearances of 3 men that McArthur eventually pleaded guilty to killing.
Right.
At the time, McArthur was only considered a witness as opposed to a suspect. And why is that?
Well, in 2013, you've got to remember that what we're dealing with are missing persons. We're not dealing with any particular offense at that point in time. And so a lot of people talk about witness versus person of interest versus suspect. So at that point in time, everybody in those investigations is essentially a witness until you have evidence that an offense has actually taken place. You can't assign someone the label of person of interest. You can't assign someone the label of suspect. So everyone becomes a witness. And in 2013, the investigators working on that case did not know what had happened to those men. They didn't know if they had been kidnapped, whether they had been murdered, whether they had taken off on their own volition, or met with foul play at all. They simply did not know. And Mr. MacArthur was interviewed at that point in time in 2013 and associated to several of those men. But other than that, we really had nothing at that point in time.
So there was no evidence on hand that would have indicated to police that he might have been the one responsible?
Correct.
Okay. Now, Project Houston was shut down in 2014. 3 years later, Project Prism was launched. If you could tell us a little bit about the task force and what led to its creation.
Well, in spring of 2017, Salim Essen went missing. And then in June of 2017, Andrew Kinsman went missing. And having the knowledge of the 3 previously reported missing persons, and now 2 more from the village had gone missing. So the unit commander at 51 Division at the time said, we've got to readdress this problem and either reopen Project Houston or start a new task force. So Project Prism was created, and during Project Houston, some evidence had come up in 2012 that caused myself to be assigned to oversee that project from a homicide perspective. And because of that knowledge and that expertise, they wanted homicide involved in Project Prism as well.
What was that evidence?
That evidence was the cannibalism evidence that came up in 2012 that had to be investigated and ultimately excluded, which is what happened in 2013. I know it's hard to kind of keep track of everything that was going on. So when Project Prism was initiated, Detective Dickinson from my team was assigned as the primary investigator, and I was available for consultation and advice through the early stages of that. And then once we had that evidence that at least we knew Andrew Kinsman had been killed, and that escalated it to murder, and then I become involved as the major case manager of Project Prism.
Right. Now, with regards to the death of Andrew Kinsman, MacArthur was considered a person of interest at the time. And so what led police to believe this?
We had recovered to start at the beginning, there was some video surveillance from Andrew Kinsman's neighborhood, which ultimately was analyzed, and a red Dodge Caravan was identified, and then that Dodge Caravan was ultimately linked to Mr. MacArthur, and then we located and seized that caravan in September of 2017, and a forensic examination of that caravan led to the recovery of some blood. And in November of 2017, that blood was identified as belonging to Andrew Kinsman. So once you have that evidence in hand, you can say, I now have evidence that Andrew Kinsman has been murdered, and Bruce MacArthur is a suspect in the murder of Andrew Kinsman. Right,
that there's that link there. Now, would you say that this connection between MacArthur and the death of Andrew Kinsman was what sort of got the ball rolling in the Bruce MacArthur case overall?
Definitely. It gave us the ability to obtain judicial authorizations to conduct surveillance, to search Mr. MacArthur's computer. And ultimately, in January of 2018, the results of that search were discovered, and photographs of Mr. Essen actually were first found on January 17th of 2018, which then gave us the evidence and the ability to say we now have the evidence to say Mr. MacArthur is a suspect in the murder of Salim Essen. And shortly afterward, within hours, photographs were also found of Andrew Kinsman, which really strengthened the evidence against him for Andrew Kinsman.
Okay. Now fast forward to July of 2018, warmer weather allowed police to use cadaver dogs while searching 53 Mallory Crescent, where the remains of all 8 victims were found through excavation. And there was a point at which you concluded that there was no further evidence to suggest any more victims.
Right.
I'd like to know how it felt at that moment to say something like that.
Well, I'm not completely excluding the possibility that there may be more historic victims, but I'm fairly confident in stating that we believe we've accounted for all the victims from Scandinavian in 2010 onwards.
Okay.
And part of that is the remains recovered at Mallory, which can all be accounted for, can all be linked to the 8 known victims, in the absence of any unidentified remains from that excavation and that recovery, as well as what we can now say is a file system that Mr. MacArthur kept on his computer where he accounted for all of the victims, at least from 2010 onwards. Right. So we're still looking at cold cases from previous decades, but right now we have absolutely nothing to link with Mr. MacArthur to any previous victims to 2010.
So how did it feel at that moment? It seemed as though you had almost reached a sort of conclusion, at least as you were saying from 2010 onwards, that there's no other remains here. There are no other victims here. How did it feel at that moment to be able to say something like that and essentially start to reach the conclusion of these excavations?
Yeah, and even going back to, like I said, in January of 2017, where we had no remains whatsoever, and then finding those first sets of remains and being able to identify them. And I was recently looking through my notes and my timelines on the dates where the anthropologist was coming to the conclusions through early 2018, where she could first say, okay, we have at least 5 victims represented in these remains. And then, okay, we have at least 7 victims represented in these remains. And we could account for all of them. But we didn't know what had happened to Majid Kayan, who was probably Mr. MacArthur's 3rd victim. And in July, we recovered the remains in the ravine, which turned out to be Mr. Kayan's remains. And that was a great feeling of relief to be able to say, okay, we can now account for 8 victims, and we can now account for all the remains for all of those victims, and we're going to get those remains back to the families. And it's not a nice feeling, but it is definitely a relieved feeling to be able to say that.
Now, you had mentioned previously this idea of not necessarily ruling out any connections to previous missing persons cases. So does that mean you're still looking at possible connections to missing persons cases, as previously mentioned, from the 70s and the 80s? Is that something that is ongoing? That is still ongoing. It's almost complete, and I don't want to give a timeline on when it will be complete. But like I said, at this point in time, we have nothing to link Mr. MacArthur to any of those historic cases. Okay. What do you think made Project PRISM so successful in comparison to Project Houston? Ultimately, it was the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman, the fast reporting of the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman, and the wherewithal of the first responding officers to recover that video. And there's a lot of ifs. If he hadn't been reported quite so quickly, if they hadn't seized the video from the neighborhood without knowing what they were going to be looking for, seizing that video, if it wasn't for the officers who diligently went through that video and found this van that was circling around the block and said, hey, what's up with that van? And then having clear enough video to be able to specify what type of van it was, and all of the links from then on. Like I said, there's a lot of ifs, and if one of those links had been broken, I don't know that we ultimately would have gotten to where we got to in 2018. Okay. We are going to take a short break. We will be right back with Inspector Hank Idsinga.
Correio da Manhã Canadá Televisão, 24 horas por dia no canal 893 da Bell 5, agora também na City TV. Todos os domingos, entre as 11h30 e o meio-dia, acompanhe a CMC TV, com reportagens da comunidade, entrevistas, entretenimento e muito mais. CMC TV agora também na City TV. Mais televisão, melhor televisão.